In Soviet crime history, some of the most haunting cases did not begin in major capitals. They began on village paths, near forest edges, beside schoolyards, and in small towns where distance slowed everything. These crimes mattered not only because of what happened, but because rural life itself, trust, isolation, and delay, made them harder to stop and harder to understand. Welcome to Dark Files of the USSR. This is the channel where we uncover hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker realities behind the image of Soviet order. When people think about Soviet crime, they often imagine big cities, famous investigations, or cases that later became national scandals. But some of the most chilling cases grew in smaller places. Industrial towns, district roads, village outskirts, and wooded spaces just beyond ordinary life. These environments mattered. In rural and provincial areas, witnesses were fewer, distances were longer, and separate attacks were harder to connect into one pattern. A case could remain local rumor long before it became a recognized investigation. That is what makes these rural murder cases so important historically. They reveal not only the actions of individual offenders, but also the limits of a system that often responded too slowly when danger hid behind familiarity. In small communities, people tended to trust local routines more deeply. A child walking home, a youth club leader taking boys on hikes, a worker moving through district roads, or a familiar adult appearing in the wrong place might not trigger alarm quickly enough. By the time the pattern became clear, years could already have passed. One of the earliest and most disturbing examples is Vladimir Vinichevsky, later called the Urals Monster. He was convicted of 18 attacks on children in 1938 and 1939 across Sverdlovsk, Nizhny Tagil, and Kushva, 8 of them fatal. What makes his case especially relevant here is the geography. These were not crimes confined to one tightly watched urban center. They were spread across several Ural towns and nearby spaces, making the pattern harder to identify quickly. Later accounts note that investigators struggled because survivors could not always clearly describe him. Some complaints were delayed, and the attacks were not immediately linked into one series. Vinichevsky's arrest shows how much rural and provincial cases could depend on chance. On October 24, 1939, police cadets noticed him carrying a small boy toward the woods near Verkhnaya Pishma and intervened in time. That detail is important. The crime was not hidden in some distant wilderness. It was moving from ordinary public space into a more isolated place where help might not arrive quickly enough. In a rural or semi-rural environment, that short distance can mean everything. It can separate a visible event from an invisible one. A second case, from a later period, is Anatoly Slivko in Nevinomysk. Slivko was not seen as an outsider. He organized youth activities, founded a club, and was praised by parents for working with local boys and keeping them occupied. According to later reporting, he regularly took boys on hiking and hill climbing trips, often for days at a time. In a large city, that kind of adult control over children might have drawn quicker scrutiny. In a provincial setting, mixed with trust and routine, it lasted much longer. What makes Slivko's case especially chilling is how long it remained hidden. He was later convicted of killing 7 boys between 1964 and 1985. After the disappearance of one boy, Sergei Pavlov, police initially believed he had likely run away. That is one of the clearest patterns in rural or small-town investigations. A disappearance is first explained through ordinary behavior instead of immediate danger. The case only turned when prosecutor Tamarashe Langueva began actively re-examining the disappearance and connected it to earlier missing boys, linked to the same youth club. That persistence broke the pattern of local normalization that had protected him for years. A third case shows how even territory close to Moscow could function like a rural murder zone when forests, district roads, and camp perimeters were involved. Sergei Golovkin, later known as Fisher, was found guilty of taking the lives of 11 underage boys in the Moscow region between 1986 and 1992. Though geographically close to the capital, the relevant spaces were not urban boulevards. They were wooded districts, camp areas, and outlying routes where a person could disappear from view very quickly. Later accounts emphasize how long he remained unidentified. Golovkin's case matters because it exposed how weak early intervention could be even when warning signs existed. Later reporting says an earlier attack in 1984 had already triggered a search, but investigators focused on the wrong suspect and the case stalled. That is another recurring feature of rural and semi-rural cases. Thin evidence, dispersed crime scenes, and long intervals between attacks make it easier for investigators to lock onto the wrong explanation. Meanwhile, the offender continues to move through ordinary life. He was ultimately connected to crimes committed over several years, which is exactly what makes the case feel so haunting in retrospect. The pattern was there, but it took too long to fully see it. Then there is Nikolai Zhumagaliev in the Kazakh SSR, a case shaped by even greater physical isolation. According to case summaries, one of his earliest known murders in 1979 took place on a rural path outside Uzinagash, and the body was later discovered by local residents. A criminal case was opened, but the investigation did not identify him at that stage. This is exactly the problem with rural crime scenes. They can begin with almost no reliable witness network, little physical evidence that survives clearly, and long delays before investigators understand whether one event is linked to others. His case also reveals another crack in Soviet justice. After an earlier fatal shooting involving a coworker in 1979, Zhumagaliev was arrested, diagnosed with schizophrenia at the Serbsky Center, and released in less than a year. He then returned to Uzinagash, where he killed again. That sequence matters because it shows how distance and weak intervention can combine. In a large, highly visible setting, a person already linked to a serious act of violence might face stronger ongoing scrutiny. In a rural environment, re-entry into ordinary life could happen more quietly, with fewer eyes on it and fewer warning structures around vulnerable people. These cases are different in period, place, and victim profile, but they are linked by the same underlying conditions. Rural and provincial life creates trust. Trust lowers suspicion. Scattered settlements slow the linking of cases. Forest edges, district roads, village paths, and long transport routes reduce witnesses. Small communities also generate rumor very quickly, but rumor is not the same as justice. It can spread fear without producing proof. In all 4 cases, the authorities eventually identified the offender, but in each one, the setting helped delay recognition of the full pattern. Another important point is that these crimes were not always hidden because the places were empty. Often, they were hidden because the places felt ordinary. A yard in a Ural town, a youth club in a provincial city, a camp route in the Moscow region, a village path outside Uzinagash. None of these places automatically signal danger. That is what made them so difficult. The offenders were able to work inside familiar local routines, and familiar routines are often what people stop questioning first. These cases show something important about rural life, not only in the USSR, but more broadly. Isolation does not always mean dramatic remoteness. Sometimes it means being just far enough from visibility that response becomes slower, trust becomes thicker, and patterns emerge too late. In the Soviet context, that was intensified by weak public transparency and a system that often preferred order and appearance over fast acknowledgement of danger. These were not only murder cases, they were also lessons in how environment shapes justice. They also show why memory lasts so strongly in smaller places. A major city can sometimes absorb crime into its scale. A small town or district cannot. The memory lingers in roads, woods, club buildings, camp areas, and the stories communities tell afterward. That is why these cases still feel so heavy decades later. They were not just crimes committed in rural places. They were crimes that changed how those places were remembered. In the end, the most chilling rural murder cases of the USSR were not only about the offenders themselves. They were also about the spaces that sheltered them. The district road, the forest edge, the trusted local club, the camp route, and the settlement where everyone thought they understood what was normal. In the Soviet Union, distance did not just separate places. Sometimes it separated crimes from justice long enough to make the damage far worse. This is Dark Files of the USSR. If you want more fact-based stories about hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker side of Soviet history, subscribe and stay with us.